Last Monday in Yerevan, Armenia, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney said something that landed differently than most political statements do. Standing at the 8th European Political Community Summit, he told the assembled leaders, and I'm quoting directly here, "It is my strong personal view that the international order will be rebuilt, but it will be rebuilt out of Europe." That is a striking thing to say. And it is worth sitting with for a moment, because Carney was not a casual participant at this event. He was the first non-European leader ever invited to attend an EPC summit. The European Political Community, for context, is an intergovernmental forum launched in 2022 following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It brings together nearly 50 heads of state and government from across the European continent, plus invited guests, to discuss security, connectivity, and the strategic future of the region. The summit in Yerevan, held on May 4th, was the largest international political event Armenia has hosted since gaining independence. The fact that Carney was there at all reflects how much the Canada-Europe relationship has shifted in the past year. He held bilateral meetings with the leaders of France, Italy, Poland, Spain, Ukraine, Armenia, the European Council, the European Commission, and the European Parliament over the course of the visit. He also announced a new Canadian contribution of approximately $270 million, or $200 million US, toward critical military capabilities sourced from the NATO prioritized Ukraine requirements list. Those are concrete, traceable actions, not just rhetoric. But the statement about rebuilding the international order from Europe is what generated the most attention. And it did not come out of nowhere. It is the latest articulation of a foreign policy argument Carney has been building for months, one that started in a very different setting. Back in January at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Carney gave a speech that drew significant international attention. He argued that the world was experiencing what he called a rupture, not a transition. His position, stated plainly, was that the rules-based international order that had structured global relations since the end of the Cold War had effectively broken down. The strongest countries, he said, had always been willing to exempt themselves from the rules when it was convenient. That fiction, in his view, no longer served anyone. And waiting for the old order to return was not a viable strategy. So when Carney stood in Yerevan and made the statement about Europe, he was not improvising. He was connecting a thread that has been running through his foreign policy since he took office. Here is where things become more complex, because the specific framing Carney used at the EPC summit deserves careful attention. He did not say the international order will be led by Europe or dominated by Europe. He said it will be rebuilt out of Europe. That phrasing matters because it suggests Europe as a foundation, a starting point, rather than a new hegemon. In Davos, Carney spelled out the underlying logic in more detail. His core argument was that middle powers, countries with significant weight but not superpower status, face a specific kind of vulnerability in an era of great power competition. If they negotiate bilaterally with large powers, they are doing so from a position of weakness. The only path to genuine influence, in his view, is coalition building with other like-minded states. He put it this way at Davos: middle powers must act together, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. The question then becomes, what does that coalition actually look like? Carney has been fairly consistent in describing its outlines. In February 2026, Canada became the first non-European country to join the EU's Security Action for Europe initiative, known as SAFE. That is a €150 billion EU-backed defense loan program. Canada's participation was described by the government as unlocking billions of dollars in market access for Canadian defense industries. Canada and the EU also formalized a new strategic partnership of the future in June 2025, covering trade, technology, energy, and security. At the EPC summit, Carney added another layer to the picture. He announced that Canada had struck critical minerals agreements worth approximately $18 billion across 20 mineral categories over the past year, and described those assets as being reserved, his term was warehoused, for government-to-government deals, starting with G7 partners and then extending to European allies more broadly. So the practical architecture Carney is building includes deepened security cooperation through SAFE, expanded trade through existing free trade agreements, critical minerals partnerships, and now a visible presence at forums like the EPC that Canada had never attended before. He also described Canada as, in his words, the most European of non-European countries, a phrase he has used on more than one occasion, and which signals how he wants this relationship to be understood. And then, the day after returning from Yerevan, Carney announced his choice for Canada's next Governor General. He named Louise Arbour, a former Supreme Court justice, former chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, and former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Carney described her directly as someone who embodies Canada's commitment to international law and accountable institutions. That appointment, coming immediately after the Yerevan summit, reads less like coincidence and more like deliberate signal. What stands out here is the gap between the ambition of the framing and the practical constraints that remain in place. Carney is articulating a coherent foreign policy vision. The individual pieces, SAFE membership, critical minerals deals, EPC attendance, the Arbour appointment, all point in the same direction. The question worth asking is whether the direction is achievable and whether Europe is actually positioned to anchor a rebuilt international order in the way Carney is describing. Some analysts and policymakers have pushed back on exactly this point. The Heinrich Böll Stiftung, a respected European policy institute, published a direct response to Carney's Yerevan statement, arguing that the international order will not be rebuilt out of Europe, but with Europe, alongside many countries across the world that share an interest in a predictable, rules-based system. Their position is that Carney's framing, however well-intentioned, risks overstating Europe's capacity to serve as the structural foundation for a new global order, particularly at a moment when European countries themselves are grappling with significant internal divisions and security pressures. That is a substantive critique. Europe is the world's largest single market and a major financial power, but it does not act as a unified geopolitical actor in the way that framing implies. Individual member states have different interests, different threat perceptions, and different levels of commitment to the kind of values-based coalition Carney is describing. And the summit in Yerevan, while significant symbolically, produced no binding decisions. EPC summits are designed for dialogue, not formal agreements. There is also a broader question about consistency. A CBC analysis published in late April examined how Carney's Davos commitments to values-based realism hold up against his actual policy choices since January. The assessment was mixed. On some fronts, Canada has moved credibly toward the positions Carney outlined. On others, including Canada's initial response to the U.S.-Israel conflict with Iran, the government appeared to hold back criticism in ways that looked more like the accommodating posture Carney warned against at Davos. His office later offered a more nuanced position, affirming that international law binds all parties in a conflict. But the episode illustrated that the gap between rhetoric and execution is a genuine challenge, not a hypothetical one. This raises a key question about what Carney's coalition of rule of law-minded democracies actually requires from its members in terms of consistency. If a country can selectively apply the values it claims to champion, the coalition's credibility depends entirely on that selection being defensible. Former Canadian ambassador and international lawyer Sabina Nolka made the point that smaller powers face real constraints when taking principled positions because they are exposed to trade retaliation in ways that larger blocs are not. That is a fair point. It is also an argument that Carney made himself in Davos, that shared investment in resilience is cheaper than each country building its own fortress alone. The coherence of the project depends on how seriously that collective investment is pursued. At this point, the situation shifts from the immediate events to the structural question. What Carney is describing is not just a bilateral Canada-Europe relationship. He is sketching the outlines of something more ambitious, a network of middle powers and democracies that share enough common ground on rule of law, sovereignty, and institutional accountability to function as a coherent force in international affairs, even as the great power rivalry between the United States, China, and Russia defines the dominant axis of global competition. The Yerevan summit matters in that context because of what it represents geopolitically, not just symbolically. Armenia is a small country in the South Caucasus that is actively repositioning itself away from its historical alignment with Russia and toward a closer relationship with Europe. The summit took place following a peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The EU held its first ever bilateral summit with Armenia on the following day. Russia, traditionally Armenia's main security guarantor, was conspicuously absent from the room. The context in which Carney made his statement about rebuilding the international order from Europe was itself a live demonstration of what that process might look like in practice. And the Louise Arbour appointment adds a dimension to this picture that goes beyond domestic constitutional roles. Arbour's career as prosecutor of war crimes in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, as UN Human Rights Commissioner, as a consistently visible voice for international accountability, represents a specific tradition of legal internationalism. Carney said at the announcement that Canada is a beacon to a world lost at sea, and that Arbour will be the guardian of Canada's constitutional order. He also explicitly connected her appointment to the current pressures on Canada's constitutional framework, including potential separation referendums in Alberta and Quebec. The appointment carries meaning on multiple levels simultaneously. Whether this vision translates into durable structural change is genuinely uncertain. Carney himself acknowledged at Davos that sovereignty will increasingly be anchored in the ability to withstand pressure, not just in rules. That is a more candid admission than leaders typically make in public forums. It implies that the path he is describing requires Canada and its partners to build real economic and security leverage, not just make principled statements. The critical minerals strategy, the safe membership, the defense contribution to Ukraine, all of these are attempts to build that leverage. But they are early-stage efforts in a project that, if it is to work as Carney is describing, requires sustained political will across multiple governments and electoral cycles. The world Carney is describing, one where the rules-based order is rebuilt through a coalition of middle powers anchored around European values and institutions, is coherent as a vision. Whether it is realistic as a project is the question that the next several years will begin to answer. And Canada's role in that process, however it unfolds, will be shaped significantly by whether Carney can close the gap between the clarity of the argument and the consistency of the execution. What do you think about this? Is the vision Carney is laying out actually achievable? Or is it a framework that runs ahead of the political will required to back it up?